I don't know if I'm muted or not.
I think he's just waiting.
It doesn't matter. Do you want to just sit chair over?
No, I'm fine.
Because I can get rid of this chair.
That's good. I can hear you.
Okay. I think I'm in.
Starting with the state, could decide it all. Is covering the Biden campaign in Pittsburgh, where I understand there might be a lady.
Michael Summer, honey, please mute
Jacob
yourselves.
said
Yeah.
he could teach me, tell me how to do it, but I didn't bother.
The two main ones we've seen
Michael
on display.
Summer there, I can see.
Michael Summer. There he is.
Yeah.
Michael
I don't know.
and honey, please put your mute on.
Relentlessly, what you would call
Me?
blue wall state.
Michael,
Yes. I'm
put
trying
your
to.
mute on.
I'm asking everybody to mute.
Everybody mute.
I'm trying to
We're
find the
waiting
mute
for you.
button.
Get unmuted.
Yes.
Hello. I think we should be ready to begin. And I am going to introduce David. It's my first time to have the pleasure of introducing my son to a crowd, and so this is something very special for me. I can tell you that even as a very young child, he was very interested in history. He asked a lot of questions and soaked up a lot of information. And then when he went off to Trent, they nurtured his interest in history and politics and gave him the confidence to go on to something more. Sometime later, he went off to Chicago to study American history. And oddly enough, it wasn't until recently that I asked David, why American history? And he told me that it was because he had been profoundly influenced by David and Millie Bakken. Some of you will know them because they taught at York University, but David got to know them because their son Jacob was his very good friend from Trent. Obviously, David and Millie touched many lives, including David's, not just for their teaching, but also for the work they did to advocate for alternative schools and the elimination of corporal punishment in schools. You can see that influence that carries on into David's doctoral dissertation, which looked at the impact that draft dodgers had on the city of Toronto. And he concluded that they made Toronto a much more progressive place. Today, although he teaches American history, a lot of what he does is centered on human rights and social justice. And you can see that that's the lens that he uses when he looks at issues like those that we are going to talk about tonight. He's going to talk to us for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to have an open discussion. And you all know that he has said, ask me anything. So David, take the podium.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope everyone can hear. If you have questions, type them into the chat, and maybe, that's probably the best way while everyone's muted, at least, to let me know what's going on, and I'll try to respond. It might take a little bit of a lag. Sometimes I don't see the little bubble pop up with 1 or 2 questions, but I'll try. My students get frustrated when I don't see that they're trying to talk to me. So thanks very much for that kind intro and for inviting me and for allowing me to share some time with you. I'm been doing a little bit of obsessive reading and listening to political podcasts and reading the Times and trying to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow. So some of this is sort of thinking through for myself, and some of it would be the kinds of background information, the kind of history about elections and why maybe things are so strange in the United States in terms of what could happen, all the scenarios people keep talking about, and the nature of democracy itself in the US, like how it's come to be, and maybe some of its shortcomings, which are going to be very present if things are very close and divisive tomorrow night. So with that in mind, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background. So one of the things that is important to remember about the Constitution and about the way the United States was put together is they were kind of obsessed with this idea of tyranny. You know, the tyranny of King George III, you know, the tyranny of empire, and they were going to try to do something different. And they saw this tyranny as something that could really impact them right away, immediately in their everyday lives. And it came from different places, not just from one place, but from multiple places. So first and foremost, it's external. So the biggest threat to the viability of the United States as an independent nation is, of course, Great Britain from England. They had just declared independence, but it didn't mean that there wasn't going to be another war or that they were going to undermine what the colonies had tried to do. And then, of course, they were fearful that some individual would rise up and proclaim themselves king and destroy the liberty that they had secured. And then finally, and this is probably the one that affects what we're going to talk about today the most, is they were very worried about the tyranny of the majority. And this is an important thing to think about how politics was understood at the very beginning of the founding. Remember, this is a world without much communication. Things are very local. And that local independence was something that was really treasured. And one of the things that they really wanted to prevent was that some other people who lived maybe a couple of days ride away might tell you how you're supposed to be living your life. And so there's this fear that other people, and maybe there's more of them over in that other community, in that other state, are going to impose their values and their beliefs on you. Now, that sounds all fairly progressive and thoughtful, like, the idea that we should be independent, we should have autonomy, we should be sovereign. But in this case, it doesn't necessarily work the way we might think of it in the modern day. So one of the things that we have to remember is the people who were worried about the majority were in fact a very elite and privileged minority, a minority of wealthy white men, many who owned slaves. Now, the United States government is divided, as I'm sure all of you know, into 3 branches: the executive branch, which is the presidency, and the cabinet officers and the agencies of the government; the judiciary, which is the Supreme Courts and the federal courts; and of course, the Congress, which is divided into 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, the strange thing about all this government is only one part of one branch is actually elected through direct elections, and that's the House of Representatives. Every 2 years, there's an election and people vote, and they vote for a member, a House representative, and that's a direct vote. All the others, in a sense, are indirect. That is to say that for most of the history of the first 100 years or so of the United States, senators were not elected. they were appointed. They were appointed by state houses in different states. So there was no election directly from the people. The president of the United States is not actually elected to this day through direct elections. They are instead, when you go and cast your vote in Virginia or in Montana or in Alaska, you're voting for a slate of electors to the Electoral College. And so that is an indirect form of representative democracy. The idea behind all of this is to make sure that the tyranny of the majority doesn't happen, to rein in these other interests, to balance power, and in a sense, make it in some ways difficult for one group to dominate another group. So why did they develop this crazy system, and why did they want to keep power away from direct democracy? Now, there's some debate, and you may have read some articles about the United States as a republic and not a democracy. And that's not really true. That is to say that, the United States is a representative democracy, like other representative democracies. But when the framers were thinking, they were reading, ancient literature, Greeks and Romans, and their notion of democracy was very personal, very intimate, very sort of in your face, much like probably the condo association. That would be a democracy in a sense that you know each other and you participate in the public life of your building. It's direct. In a world where you don't know who other people are and they're very distant and you can't get on the phone and you can't get on the email, you can't do any of these things, it's kind of scary because you're in a world that's very indirect. So it's representative and there's a sort of stage of removal. So keep that in mind. And so republic, that's what they meant by it, a representative democracy. And I think, people talked about themselves as democratic republicans. So that would be the term that they would use to describe themselves and their country and even their political parties. That's why we have these two terms, Democrat and Republican. And they were used over and over again by various politicians and political parties through the first 100 years or so of the United States. Okay. Minority rights. Now, one of the most bitter legacies of all of this and of American democracy is the reality of slavery. Slavery is something that is part of the very DNA of the US Constitution. And the protections for slave owners, who are a fairly small group, a fairly small minority in some of the states, are really crucial. Now, when the Constitution was written, majority of the states were slave-owning states, but only Virginia really had a population of any size comparable to New York and Pennsylvania and some of the other bigger states that had fairly small slave populations. And indeed, within a few decades, almost all northern states had eliminated slavery. And so in the first little while of the new nation, there is this demographic shift going on. The North grows, its population grows, and the political power of the North also increases. But they become areas where there are not slaves. So by the time of the Civil War, as new states have come in, the slave states are now a minority. And so part of the process and part of the tensions within the American electorate is to salvage the right to own slaves. And indeed, there's all these compromises around that. So the framers, for example, wanted to include population counts for the House of Representatives, so that you can figure out each constituency was supposed to be about the same size. But in the South, the number of white people was quite limited in some places, especially where there were large plantations. So they worked out this deal in which 3/5 of slaves would be counted in the enumeration for members of the House of Representatives. So here you have this kind of gift to the southern states, to slaveholding states, where they've got more representation, even as they denied the legal personhood of slaves in terms of who belongs to the nation. So part of this world of slavery, really tells us all about the first 100 or so years of America and the sort of political challenges that are implicit there. And the rivalries and the fractions that will result in the Civil War are principally around slavery and whether it should continue or expand. And as the nation was growing, increasingly large numbers and parts of the United States were free. That is, they were abolishing slavery. States' rights, people often say, oh, well, you know, when I was growing up, people, or maybe also when you were in school, people would say, oh, it wasn't, Civil War wasn't over slavery, it was over states' rights. But this is actually wrong. Southern Confederate slave-owning states, they liked states' rights. They didn't necessarily like states' rights in all cases. Famously, the Fugitive Slave Act, which is a law which said that if your slave runs away to a free area, it doesn't matter if New York or Massachusetts has abolished slavery, you and the federal government can reach out and pull that slave back because they're your property, and it says quashes the local rights of a state to say, no, we're abolishing slavery. So that's a perfect example of the way that in those cases, that proves, if you shows the lie of that argument. All right, so I'm going to keep going. I know I'm trying to get through a lot here. You'll have the recording so you can go back through it if you're interested in some of the slides. The United States is an early democracy. These elections did not involve the majority of people. And it takes a very long time for that majority to become enlarged. One of the things and one of the areas that happens that is in the so-called era of Jacksonian democracy. Oh, I'm getting all kinds of chat. Yes, the lecture is being recorded. Yes. All right, sorry. Just go back a slide there, sorry. So this period of expanding the male franchise, that means white men being able to vote, happens very slowly. And it's really not until the 1850s when there is so-called universal manhood suffrage. This sort of free suffrage movement for white men to be able to vote doesn't really secure itself until the years just before the Civil War. And that was because there were all kinds of prohibitions and restrictions on who could vote. You had to own property. You had to be able to pay a poll tax. And those things, and poll taxes are going to be used over and over again to restrict the vote in other periods of time. So American democracy is very limited. It only works for some people. And it's not until the 1856 that it really starts being a democracy for white men. But of course, that leaves out the majority of people who actually live in the United States: women and slaves and free blacks, who are often excluded. So the right for blacks to vote in the United States is not secured until after the Civil War, until 1870, in the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And that's an important amendment. It's part of 3 amendments that are brought in right after the Civil War, which abolish slavery and provide due process under law and establish the voting rights for Black Americans. It also ushers in a very short period of time when Black Americans are able to participate in US democracy. And it only lasts for about 20 years. And it begins right after the war, and it ends with the emergence of segregation, racial segregation, and the laws around segregation that are brought in by the states to restrict the lives of African Americans. So here's a little chart. and it shows two different things. If you look at the red line, that is the participation and of Black members to state legislatures in the 19th century. So starting in 1868, we see a really significant number. They get the vote, and all of a sudden there are a lot of Black politicians in Southern legislatures. And then you see that drop off a cliff. And that is the moment when new laws are brought in to restrict Black participation in the political process. Segregation laws, so-called Jim Crow laws. And then by 1892, there are basically no African Americans participating in the politics of the South. They're not voting and they're not being elected to office. The blue line is the line of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. And we can see in 1960, there are no Black politicians in the South. And starting in about 1965, when the Voting Rights Act comes in, you start seeing a few. But it doesn't even meet the 19th century standard until 1972. It's incredible to think about it. And then since then, we've seen the increase. So part of that gives us an idea of the way that Black political participation was repressed and the way that the Voting Rights Act, which is an important piece of civil rights legislation, provided an opportunity for African Americans to be able to vote. So the 19th Amendment is the amendment to the Constitution that allows women the right to vote. It comes in 1920. And the movement, the suffrage movement for the right for women to vote, happens at the same time the free suffrage movement was going on. It's not like one happened and then the other happened. They actually were happening at the same time. It's just white men got the right to vote and white women did not. In 1848, of course, there was the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the real beginning of the American suffrage movement. And there's a declaration of sentiments based on the Declaration of Independence, in which the women gathered talked about the way that they were denied their political rights. It's an important document, and it's the starting point of a movement that takes over 60 years, or sorry, it takes 80 years to
join the meeting.
And it's interesting, there's only one woman who signed the Declaration of Sentiments, Charlotte Woodward Pierce, who was alive in 1920, who could potentially cast the vote. She was a 19-year-old factory girl who worked in a glove factory, and she and her friends went to hear the convention, and she signed the declaration. Sadly, she was very sick and ill and couldn't actually cast her vote. So though she lived to see it happen, she wasn't able to enjoy the franchise. And to think all the women who signed that declaration, who fought all their lives, only one survived to actually see it to fruition. The other thing is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, excuse me. And John Lewis, who just passed away this year, famously is associated with that. He was one of the young activists who was at the forefront of that movement to try to secure the vote in states like Alabama and Mississippi, where segregation laws denied them the right to vote. And they did that through poll taxes, through literary tests, and through violence and intimidation. That day, in the picture I have of John Lewis there on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, is of course famous because he was badly beaten by police with clubs shortly after this picture was taken. Just to let you know, Edmund Pettus was a slave owner and a Confederate general. And there's a campaign right now to have that bridge renamed the John Lewis Bridge. And I really hope that they choose to do that, because I think that would be wonderful and an important symbol of the way that America needs to change. All right, so that's all the past. I just want to quickly go over what maybe is happening now and why things happened in 2016. And there's lots of different reasons, but the biggest reason Trump won was because Republicans voted for Trump. And I know that sounds kind of pretty simple, but in 2016, we didn't really think that was going to happen. Trump wasn't necessarily that popular with Republicans at first, and it took a while. And there were a lot of misgivings about him. He wasn't actually seen as a Republican, after all. He'd never really been part of the party in any significant way. But by the time the election came around, all those misgivings were off. And what's more, even if they didn't like Trump, they really hated Hillary Clinton. And there's a lot of studies that show that negative motivation was a big factor in 2016. And indeed, some have argued that positive motivation for Democrats was low because Hillary, for whatever reason, did not necessarily motivate Democrats to get out and vote. So Democrat turnout was low because of the lack of enthusiasm, and Republican turnout was high. Evangelical support. Trump has received massive evangelical support. And even though evangelicals only make up 17% of the US population, they make up a disproportionately large percentage of the vote, 25%. So evangelical vote, even as the demographics are sort of against them, the organizing in the communities has been so significant, they're very successful in getting out the vote. So that's been a key factor in the sort of base and support for the Republicans. Trump appeals to many working class Obama supporters who thought he was going to change things and stir things up. In some ways, the people gave Obama that opportunity because he wasn't like every other politician. First of all, he was Black. And so they thought, no, he's going to do something different. And they sort of thought Trump was going to do something different too. So he does well amongst there. Now, we should watch districts that Obama won twice that then Trump won. So on election night, these are good districts to look at. They tend to be majoritarian white districts significantly and working class. Now, one other thing I want to leave you with is one of my schoolmates from the University of Chicago, Catherine Friddle, has been doing research on the opioid crisis in the United States. And she has done really great work looking at counties where the opiate crisis was quite severe. And she has a direct correlation. She shows a direct correlation between those counties and support for Trump. So these are places that were in crisis in one way or another. Opioids and economic crisis, places that weren't growing in the economy. And that seems to have also been an important site for support for Trump. I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna leave this. These are key states to follow for election night. And Florida and North Carolina in particular will be great states because the vote will be early. And I'll explain that in a sec. This is just a point that the person who wins the most votes doesn't win. This is Samuel Tilden, who won over 50% of the vote in 1876, but did not become president. That's the only time that has happened, though now we have 5 times where the person who received the most votes didn't become president, including last time with Hillary Clinton, and of course in 2000 with Al Gore. All right, I'm gonna leave you with counties to look for on election night so you can watch them. These are counties, and again, I'll send you the PowerPoint so you can follow. You can look up and see which counties and what's happening in these counties and how they're doing. If they are trending towards Biden, it's gonna be a very, very bad night for Trump. These are counties that Trump won or have a history of voting Republican, but are seen as possible places where Biden has made inroads. So rather than looking at the state vote, look at the county vote in these counties, and it'll be a good predictor of what's going to happen throughout the night. Finally, I'm going to leave you with Pennsylvania. This is a bit of a dad joke for my father and my mom because they love pickles. Also, of course, Pennsylvania is the Keystone State, and that's the symbol of Heinz, which is a Pennsylvania company. Pennsylvania is probably going to be the state that makes all the difference. And the problem with Pennsylvania is it's kind of a hot mess. The votes are counted in many different ways for the state. There are also many votes that are votes that are early that won't be counted until after the election. So on election day, the people who voted by mail those votes can't be counted until 7 a.m. And in some counties, they can't be counted until after the day of votes have counted. All that means is the results in Pennsylvania are going to be very slow. And we're going to see something like this. So at first, it might seem like Biden is up, and then it's going to seem like Trump is up, and then it might seem like Biden is up. And that is going to be something that is very difficult to watch because we're going to wonder what's going on. If it's a tight race, and it might well be, the fight is going to be over these late mail-in ballots. And Trump will definitely be wanting to suppress those ballots and say that there's something funny has happened with them. So that's going to be the political fight afterwards, and it will principally be in Pennsylvania. Okay, now I see lots of people are sending me chats. The Electoral College. Okay, so we can start the questions, and I'm happy, and I can explain the Electoral College in more detail because it is a bit technical and strange. I'm gonna unmute.
Yeah, this is David. Thank you. This is Robert Guerra. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it may be one thing that you're kind of referring to that it would be good before we get to the Q&A is maybe the point that's been made a lot in Canada and in the news recently about the US is that federal elections in Canada, there's Elections Canada, and it's a standard way of procedures, and it's across the country. So
Yeah.
And so I think maybe you can say a little bit about that in terms of why is it that not only each state, but maybe each state is so different.
Yes.
And to remember correctly, the Florida 2000 vote, you had the Chads and all.
Yeah, so the way that elections work in the US is that the elections are the responsibilities of the states rather than the federal government. The states determine how elections are to proceed. Can folks hear me? Are we cutting out at all? Okay. So Pennsylvania and New York conduct their elections differently. But even within Pennsylvania, each county within the state does its own thing. There may be sort of standards for the state, but how the ballot looks, for example, could be different. How the ballot is counted, what kind of machines are used. All these things are county by county, which is what happened in 2000, where the ballots looked really different. There was, of course, the famous punch ballot, where people were punching into the ballot with a stylus, and there were so many people voting that the machines filled up with little chads, and then they couldn't press anymore. So then you had all these dimpled chads and votes that didn't get counted. And then, of course, there was the famous butterfly ballot, in which it was very hard to understand the ballot because the names were sort of beside each other. And in an area, I forget which county it was. I think it might have been Miami-Dade or Broward. I can't remember which one. And in any case, in an area where the Democrats were expected to do very well, all of a sudden Pat Buchanan, the very conservative and actually quite problematic politician, all of a sudden got 20,000 votes. So that was because of the ballot being printed in its strange way and people being hard to read. But it was only in that county that happened. And that probably made the difference in the election, actually, the layout of that ballot.
500 votes.
Made it possible for Bush to win. Do you want me to talk of the Electoral College now? So the Electoral College is this weird thing because Americans don't actually vote directly for president. They vote state by state. Your number of electors in each state is based on the number of people in the House of Representatives, then the number in that, plus your 2 senators, so the congressional complement. It's a winner-take-all system in all but 2 states, Maine and Nebraska. They divide them up by congressional district, but all the other states, it's winner-take-all. So, you know, if there are 25,000 or 25 million votes in Florida, you know, 49.9% of those votes don't count in a sense, because if you have 1 more ballot or 5 more ballots than the other guy, you get all the Electoral College votes. And the winner-take-all system is something that has emerged. It's not in the Constitution. It's by each state decides how to do it. It's a system that's really not designed for close elections. I showed you Samuel Tilden. It's interesting, you may know that election in 1876 was a very important election because Tilden won the most votes and he was 1 Electoral College vote away from winning. But there were 4 states that were sort of up in the air. All he needed was 1 vote from one of those 4 states. What happened was the Congress was controlled by the Republicans, and they worked out a deal with the Democrats that said, okay, we'll allow the Republican to be president, but we'll end Reconstruction in the South. So we'll remove the Union, the US Army from the South, which allowed the end of Reconstruction. So again, it's a deal around race and exclusion that set that in motion. But it's a very strange system, and there's a bit of a movement to get rid of it. It almost disappeared in the late 60s and early 70s, but there was a lot of opposition again from southern states and small states that are worried that they're going to lose their say in things. So you have a situation where there are 2 senators from California, which has over 30 million people, and there are 2 senators from, you know, Montana, which has less than 1 million. Doesn't seem fair. Okay, I'm happy to answer any other questions people might have. I've gone on a little bit more than I intended, so my apologies.
I thought I had a question in the chat, but it may have been missed. Can a president like Trump refuse to leave if he loses the election?
Well, it's a real political unknown. There's actually a group in Washington who've been doing game theory on it. It's norm that the person who has been defeated leaves. That's a political norm. It's not, it's a custom. So it hasn't been tested. No one's ever not left. So, you know, this is one of the things that, you know, that Trump has been very successful at, is destroying the sort of norms. You know, people say, oh, well, the army will come and do something, but I don't think there's no legal reason the army would, you know, be able to do that. Congress can try to force removal, but, you know, the president, the executive branch, after all, controls the military and controls the security apparatus of the state. Congress doesn't. They have a sergeant at arms, and they have a few security guards, but they don't really have any martial power. So and the courts can rule that he should leave. But if he resists, I don't know. I think it would be pretty dramatic and unlikely, but who knows? Things could go that way. Now I see there is a lot of questions all of a sudden. Oops, sorry. I'll just, does that, we can go to that. All right, so let's see, I'll start. How can this election affect Canada? Well, it's hard to know. I think there are different ways, obviously, but Trump has not been super engaged with Canada in beyond the trade agreement. How I think Canada is impacted is the way that Trump has sort of disengaged from the traditional alliances. Since the Atlantic Charter, and when Roosevelt and Churchill met in Newfoundland and established the Atlantic Charter and the moment of post-war internationalism and special relationship, that has been the dominant mode of international politics for Western countries. It's a mode which has encouraged democracy and human rights and also trade and commerce. Trump doesn't really have any time for that. And so, his changing of that impacts us because we are a partner in that system, and that system is becoming weakened. Now, maybe it was time for it to be weakened and to be rethought, but Trump isn't thinking about that. It's just something he instinctively doesn't really care about, I think. Why are evangelicals so much more for Trump? Well, I think it is basically abortion. There's such a staunch, that has become the big issue. Now, it's in the history of abortion and evangelicals is interesting because, of course, in the 60s, Protestant evangelicals were not really anti-abortion. The Southern Baptists Convention supported the right of choice in the 1960s. It's hard to imagine that now, but they did. And so, that has been a sea change over time. There's a lot of research by scholars on this issue and the way that it came to be mobilized as a wedge issue in the United States, and how it's impacted different groups. But they have decided, despite the fact that Trump is not leading a pious life or a moral life, that they aren't interested in him. And that's been true really since the Carter-Reagan election. Carter is an evangelical Christian. He lives very much that life, dedicated to his faith and to witness and to work. Reagan was a divorced man who never went to church and religion wasn't part of his everyday. But in the end, evangelicals supported him because he was willing to support certain ideas around abortion principally, but also defense of conservative social issues that they supported. So Robert has a question. Don't states decide the winner of their state? So the state legislatures, if there is an inconclusive election, could potentially decide who are the electors. But it's not even that simple because the Secretary of State in each state is the person who certifies the election. So let's say in Pennsylvania, you have a very close election. And the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, who's a Democrat, says, I'm going to certify the election for Joe Biden and declare the electors for Biden. The state legislature, which is the Pennsylvania State House and the Pennsylvania Senate, are both Republican. And they could meet in joint session and say, no, we're going to send a slate that supports Trump. And they could send both slates to Washington to vote in the Electoral College. And of course, the lawyers would then be really involved, and it would go to the Supreme Court. And that's where, you know, Justice Ginsburg's death actually is really significant, because, you know, it's a chance, an opportunity there to settle the matter in court, and maybe the 6 conservative justices would vote in favor of it. So it would probably be 5-4, because I think Justice Roberts would vote with the so-called liberals, because of his desire to try to be nonpartisan, even though he's a very conservative justice. That he's tried to steer that course. What about the polls? Well, you know, the polls are interesting. There's lots of different polls. One of the things about 2016 is the polls missed voters, particularly white working class men who voted for Trump. And so the polling companies have bent over backwards to count those men. But the problem with polls is they're always sort of trying to figure out what they did wrong in the last election. So we don't know what they are doing wrong in this election. So white working class men are who without university or college educations are being counted in these polls, but maybe Hispanic men under the age of 50 are not. Or maybe some other group is being left out, and that might be a determining factor in Florida or Texas, for example. So those are issues that will happen. But I do think the polling is probably a lot better now than it was in 2016. There's a lot more of it, and you know, there's a lot more in the states. So the key states: Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania. Those states which are really going to make a difference. So we know a lot more about what's going to happen, I think. So my guess is that they're probably accurate. They're probably a little shy on Trump. The question is it 2%, 3%, or 5%? If it's 2%, Biden wins in a landslide. If it's 3%, it's closer. If it's 5% they're wrong by, it's going to be a very long month and a half figuring out who's going to be president of the United States. Many Hispanics in Florida are pro-Trump because of where they're from. So a significant portion of Hispanics in Florida are from Cuba. And so they have that anti-Castro, anti-communist tradition. And they associate the Republican Party with anti-communism. Though, you know, the Cold War's been over for a long time, and, you know, Biden is no more pro-communist than Trump. It's a ridiculous thing, but that's the politics of South Florida. The other group in South Florida that is also quite conservative are Venezuelan expatriates, and they are also very conservative, and they also have been reporting Republican. Some of that is balanced off by Puerto Ricans who are refugees from the hurricane, and of course are American citizens, and can vote. So the Puerto Rican community in around Orlando is quite significant, and we'll see if they come out to vote, because that has been, they're associated with the Democratic Party. They have that history generally, and we'll see if enough of them vote, that can offset the more conservative Hispanic vote. So it's important to remember the Hispanic vote in Florida is not uniform, and it's not uniform across the United States. Obviously, the Hispanic vote in Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, California is very, very pro-Democrat. And not to mention the Hispanic vote in the urban cities like Chicago and New York. Yes, definitely Mexican Americans, and are definitely much more pro-democratic. Oh, the Senate, isn't that an interesting one? I don't know. I think that there's a good chance that North Carolina will fall. And Maine may fall. Susan Collins may lose in Maine, but you know, the Alabama Democrat, I think, is in trouble. It's unlikely he'll win. So they have to make up ground. I think it will be close. Some of the people are saying there's a 70% chance that the Democrats can take the Senate. And that would be great, I think, for, restoring some balance, because the Senate has been so partisan. But we'll see what happens there. It's not an easy thing. Winning Senate seats is tough, and they don't necessarily always conform to the presidential election. But if Biden does very well tomorrow night, he could pull some of these people along. So there could be a spectacular upset, for example, in South Carolina. Lindsey Graham is looking like he's in trouble. And the other would be Georgia. There are 2 Senate seats up there. Georgia has a weird system. It's first, you have to get 50% of the vote to become senator. So there'll be runoffs, probably at least 1 and maybe 2. The current senator, Perdue, I think his name is looks like he might be in a bit of trouble. So we'll see. That will be an interesting Senate race to watch. But I think they have a good chance of getting a narrow majority, maybe 51 to 49, maybe 52 to 48, but probably not much more than that. And that Georgia Senate race, that's going to be fascinating. Georgia, it will be fascinating to watch. If the polls are right, it could flip, which will be a really remarkable shift. And I think it shows the changing demographics of Florida, the increasing power and influence of a Black middle class in the Atlanta suburbs, the fact that a lot of people are moving back, a lot of people who families were part of the Great Migration out of the South in the middle part of the 20th century and the early part of the 20th century, who lived in cities like Chicago and Cleveland and other cities. They're moving back to Georgia, and because the cost of living is cheaper, and sometimes jobs are better. And that's shifting the demographics in that state. There's a lot of people who didn't grow up in Georgia who are moving to Georgia. And so the cities like Atlanta are less southern than they used to be. Well, that's a really good question about if Trump loses, do you think the US can win back its stature in the world community? Well, I think it's going to take time. Like a lot has happened. And the United States, again, we're talking about norms. The United States has to present itself in a viable way as a world leader. And I think we've seen a lot of, difficult, well, look, let's think about COVID here. The failure of the United States to work comprehensively and thoughtfully with other nations has made the COVID crisis so much worse. If Biden wins and he shows leadership and they're able to do something to, let's say, get the vaccine, get a vaccine, follow protocols that are effective internationally, have fair and equitable distribution. Those would all be things that would, I think, have a real positive impact globally, and an opportunity for the new administration to reassert global leadership that way. It's not going to come from Putin, after all. You ask much better questions from my students. Wow. They're always like, will this be on the exam? My answer is always yes. Type in the chat, or maybe wave your hand, and maybe someone will notice you. And then we can unmute you. Maybe that would be easier. I think there's a very good chance that Biden's going to win. I didn't want to say it aloud. And I mean, it's funny because I don't think of myself as a superstitious person, but at some level, I didn't want to say it aloud because I thought, what? It's like, like saying something that was like taboo almost, that something you hope for, and if you say it aloud, it could injure it. And I think, I do think I think he's going to win. There's been a massive amount of voting. It's now, over 90 million, I believe. It's more than half the people who voted last time. It's a significant, it's a really significant thing. So yeah, I think it's really a good chance that he's going to win. The checks and balances in the US. Well, some of them are still there. They haven't gone away. But I would say that norms, like we were talking about the Senate earlier, the norms of the Senate blew up. And that's been a situation that the Republicans and Mitch McConnell in particular have sought to transform the Senate and use their partisan advantage because they are worried, and this is maybe ties into the next question, they are worried about changing demographics. And they are worried that once those demographics shift, that they're going to lose. So, if Georgia and Texas fall tomorrow, which I can't quite believe that would happen, but that would be a sign that the Republican Party, as it constituted now, has to change. It has to, because otherwise it will just be a rump party. And what you'll really have is a fight for control within the Democratic Party, which will be the super majoritarian party. And there'll be the kind of, the left wing of that party, Bernie and AOC and others, the squad, who will be leading the left. And then you'll have the sort of traditional middle of the road liberal Democrats, Biden and Harris and others who will, and that will become the new, division of power. But if the Republicans can't win Texas, they're done. It's over for them.
I have a question.
Sure.
What are the chances, or can Trump be held accountable once he leaves office for a lot of the criminal things that he has done?
Well, we'll see. I think one thing that might happen is that Biden might choose to direct the Justice Department not to do anything because he wants to start anew. Say, if we enter into this partisan prosecution of former presidents, it will create an endless cycle where everyone will be constantly under the threat of investigation and charges. And then that will, in a sense, create a crisis that will be unending. So that, I think, is actually might happen. That Biden, even though I'm sure he would love to see charges brought against Trump, that he'll say, the Justice Department shouldn't do that. Now, there will be limits on that, however. So there are all these cases going on right now in the Southern District of New York. Cyrus Vance Jr. has apparently an open set of cases. I wouldn't be surprised if after the election we see a whole bunch of charges come down, because they've probably been waiting until the election's over to do that.
Why is the president exempt from criminal activity when he's president? I don't understand why he has a different set of rules than everybody else.
It is kind of a weird bit of the law, but the issue is that if he is, and we can think about what happened with Nixon and it's a other, but the issue in some ways is if you can bring criminal charges against the president, legitimate or illegitimate, you can tie the presidency down, and you can create a crisis in which all the president does is answer charges. So one of the critiques of the Lewinsky-Clinton situation and the Starr investigation was that was a series of judicial inquiries, legal inquiries that just went on and on for years and years. Like Starr was investigating for 5 years or something like that. It was a huge long time. Started off with, I don't know if you remember, with Whitewater and whether there was criminal activity, and it ended up with a perjury trap over inappropriate behavior that had nothing to do with the presidency. It had to do, inappropriate, but it wasn't about the presidency. So that would be the reason, that to function, you can't be fighting off these potentially illegitimate charges. So charges could be brought necessarily by some court in some part of the United States that was driven by political reasoning. Now, I think there are very real limits. And if impeachment were to work properly, if, let's say, the president, were to commit a crime in which, let's say, he shot someone, committed murder or something like that, you can impeach him, and there would be a trial in the Senate. And if the Republicans took their oath seriously, they would have convicted Trump back in February, but they didn't. Despite the fact that he committed crimes. So there is a mechanism for the president. It's through impeachment, not through the usual judicial process. It does seem strange because he is, being treated differently, but the reality is he is treated differently. Okay. I don't know how the issue with the fracking has worked. It's a big issue in Western Pennsylvania. Biden is not anti-fracking. He's actually seems quite okay with fracking, but people have said he's anti-fracking. So we'll see how they've been able to deal with that issue locally and what happens. And I don't know on the ground what's actually going on in Pennsylvania. So we'll see if those counties support Trump and the rest of the state goes the other way, then maybe we could say, oh, it did have some impact. I heard many voted by mail wanted to revoke their votes. I'm not sure what you mean by that, revoke their votes. Do you mean they want to vote again? Or because if you vote in person, you have to get your ballot has to be destroyed. Your mail-in ballot has to be destroyed, and then you can vote again. But you have to have the physical mail-in ballot. It has to be destroyed so that you can cast another ballot. And I don't think it works in every county. I think it differs. No, I see some people with hands waving, my mother included.
Yes. I think it's about time that we called upon Lily. I think it's going to be a long night tomorrow.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the group, I'd like to thank you very much, David, for coming on and taking up the challenge to help us understand better the complexity of the US election system. You've done an excellent job in making such a complex subject understandable. But for me, the more I understand it, the more I feel that the state is not really as democratic as it seems. And as a thank you gesture, we will donate $18 in your name to the charity of your choice, Sunshine House, a charity that focuses on social integration and harm reduction in Winnipeg. Now, why $18? Most probably, that's what our budget can afford. But more interestingly, I learned from Rose Reisman and Rabbi Cerulli that it's a Jewish custom to give monetary gifts in increments of 18 because it means life in Hebrew. And for charity giving, 18 has another significance. It means that the charity given is in good standing, and it will bring us life and prosperity. So I'd like to end here with well wishes for everyone here. And thank you to David again for such an interesting talk. All right.
Thank you very much. That's very lovely.
Till next time.
Yes.
Everybody stay safe.
Thank you, Dave.